The US is unreliable, so much so that Iran won't even take its helping hand. All one need do is ask a world to testify, at least against President Trump's USA. Certainly not a deal maker, just 3 scores he's made are pullouts from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, the Paris Agreement of 2015, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership of 2016, not to mention the Iran nuclear deal of 2015. Iran is applying a straightforward logic in rejecting the US's proposed aid. It says if the US really cares, all it need do is lift sanctions off this country and Iran will look after itself. Another point is the US hasn't been able to take care of itself with the corona crisis. So what Iran is doing right next door to what was the US embassy is it's producing masks and disinfectants also to share with the US. I'm Leila Faramarzi and you're watching Iran Today. Do stay tuned. Actually, it's more than that. Iran not only sees the US offer as no use, but as potentially harmful.
چند بار تا حالا سران آمریکا گفتن که ما حاضریم که از لحاظ درمان و دارو به شما کمک کنیم. چند بار تکرار کردن. فقط شما از ما بخواهید تا ما به شما از لحاظ دارو و درمان کمک کنیم. این جزو اون حرفای بسیار عجیبه. شما آمریکایی ها متهمید به اینکه این ویروس رو شما تولید کردید. من نمیدونم چقدر این اتهام حقیقی است، اما وقتی این اتهام وجود داره کدوم عاقلی به شما اعتماد میکنه که شما بیایید برای او دارو بیارید؟ ممکنه داروی شما یه وسیله‌ای باشد برای اینکه این بیماری رو بیشتر گسترش بده. هیچ اعتباری نداره، به شما اعتمادی نیست.
Why might Iran have accused the United States of being the coronavirus maker? During World War II, the United States set up a large-scale organization to research and develop microbial and biological weapons. And over the course of 27 years, that organization has tested and stored at least 26 types of lethal microbial weapons, such as anthrax. It has even tested them on ordinary people without their knowledge during the course of the research and development of these weapons. Mr. Ruhi Safat is a former ambassador with plenty to say on how one thing leads to another in international relations. Iran categorically rejected the US offer of aid for the corona issue. Why is that? Does it have anything to do with the fact that the US could have just lifted sanctions off this country?
During the Bush administration, when the BAM quake occurred, President Bush suspended anti-Iran sanctions for 3 months so that Iran would be able to purchase some materials it needed for dealing with the quake aftermath from abroad. But now, with the outbreak of the coronavirus, no relaxation in sanctions has been seen. If President Trump was honest in saying he favors talks with Iran on equal footing, he would suspend sanctions against Iran as long as COVID-19 has not been contained so that Iran would be able to supply its medical needs. What Trump is seeking now is to have the upper hand in the future presidential elections in the US. But Trump is not the only decision maker in the US. Decisions are adopted collectively. Even if a single body favors change in attitude while others don't, the result would not be achieved.
Iran's enemies of today may be the US and its military camp in the Middle East or West Asia, Israel. But its suspicion of the West is longer lived than the US as a world power. America's predecessor Britain and the Allied forces don't have a clean slate in history either. However, they did introduce to the East this cradle of civilization and science, their own modern technology. But perhaps what they asked in return was not proportionate to what they had to offer. Mr. Makki is a political analyst with a look to contemporary history. Here's his insight. Iran was never colonized. Why all this distrust towards the West?
In the early 20th century, there was a positive attitude towards the US in Iranian society. US financial advisors came to Iran to reinvigorate Iran's financial system. However, after World War II, the US grew into a big power among Western nations and embarked on dominance and colonialism. Iran joined the countries looking at the US negatively.
From the time of wars with Russia and Britain shirking its commitments, abusing Iran to open the way to India and the like, there have been plenty of acts to rile up Iran's anger, such as one-sided oil contracts and plundering Iran's wealth, and later occupying Iran during World War II. Also forcing the Shah's hand in selecting officials for this country who would be dependent on the United States, and the cultural invasion of this country. We popped into the US Embassy, known as the Den of Espionage, and of late reopened as a museum. It seems Iran's distrust for the US just can't disappear, because every so often the US gives this country cause to renew its distrust. Iranians were pretty bothered with what's called the 1953 coup, and right after the revolution, American embassy staffers were found shredding secret documents with this device. This made Iranians think the US wants to destroy the revolution and bring it down, rather than recognize the new system of governance. And today, talk of regime change, as the US would put it, looms over this country. Actually, revolutionaries already had this fear, and it was justified after they entered the embassy and painstakingly pieced together shredded documents. In one document, an embassy staffer, John Graves, suggested a plan to his superiors in Washington. This included creating chaos in Iran and torpedoing the newborn revolution.
The US has been interfering in Iran's internal affairs for 7 decades. During the past 41 years, since the establishment of the Islamic Republic, weren't it for the US interference with Iran's internal affairs, the ground would be prepared for negotiations between the two nations. Before the seizure of the US embassy in Iran, the Iranians' view of the US was not as negative as it is today. Had the US recognized the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the trend of history and Iran-US ties would be different.
The embassy was taken over by students in November 1979, months after the victory of the Islamic Revolution, and just 2 weeks after the Shah was allowed to enter the US on medical grounds. So it is understandable why revolutionaries would envisage a pattern re-emerging. In 1953, the Shah or King returned to retake rulership from Mossadegh, the oil nationalization era prime minister, via what has come to be known as a coup d'etat. And now in 1979, he might be returned to take over from leaders of the revolution. But the circumstances were actually too different to produce the same results. Mr. Ojorlu is an editor in Iran's media world with a look in from the outside, a clear perspective of current affairs, that is.
After World War II, the US gradually became a political hegemony overpowering Britain. We entered the Cold War era. The new colonial power is the US. At the start of the Islamic Revolution, there were two views vis-à-vis the US. One was a conservative approach favored by Mehdi Bazargan and the freedom movement of Iran, and another one favored by Islamist youths. The latter believed that we will not be on equal footing with the Americans before we take revenge over the 1953 US orchestrated coup against the national government in Iran.
The 1953 coup d'etat of 19th August took place via the CIA's Operation Ajax at the behest of the British, because the Brits wanted back their most lucrative enterprise, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, that had been nationalized, beginning with a parliamentary initiative and ending with Mossadegh taking the case to The Hague. That's the International Court of Justice. My question would be, were people angry because Mohammad Reza Shah was reinstated by the coup that overthrew PM Mossadegh, or because of US interference per se? Are the Iranians angry at the US because they reinstated the Shah or because they interfered in our internal matters?
Without the US and British interference, the 1953 coup would have not succeeded to allow for the return of the fugitive Shah to power and the start of an era of despotism. The US meddled with Iran's internal political and security affairs and set up the secret Savak police that dealt with anti-despotic and revolutionary forces. The negative attitude towards the US was triggered in the intellectual community in 1953 and continued until after the Islamic Revolution. Coupled with the US's economic, political and military actions against the Islamic Republic, it gave a negative impression of the US in the society.
It would seem decoding and encrypting isn't a thing just for modern computers. The US Embassy in Tehran has been shut for the past 40 years, yet these devices did exactly that at the time, decoding and encrypting to send off secret news on this country to the US. So perhaps Iranians shouldn't have climbed embassy walls, but you can understand why they felt the way they felt once they did. The students' embassy takeover may have been impulsive and based on gut feeling, but it must have been justified in light of US unreliability, as founder of the Islamic Republic Ayatollah Khomeini later hailed the event as a second revolution with greater significance than the original revolution of 1979. Interference is still today infuriating to Iranians at large.
The voter turnout in the parliamentary election was at 42.5% in the entire country, but 70 to 80% of Iranians would have attended the funeral held for Qasem Soleimani. The figures were already high in Tehran, Kerman and Mashhad. That shows there is discontent with the economic conditions, governance, how people are dealt with, and discontent with corruption. But it does not mean that Iranians are aligned with the regime change policy pursued by Western governments, particularly the US.
Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. The Islamic Revolution was formed on the basis of removing the influence of the United States and the West and cutting off the hands of aggressors and dictators. Anyhow, to get back on track, the US is unreliable to Iranians not only because of interference and twisting this country's fate to suit their own, but because, as John Schwartz wrote in 2015 on The Intercept, not only have the US and our allies done horrendous things to Iran, we are not even polite enough to remember it. Regarding the coup, however, on its 60th anniversary, the CIA finally admitted to its role. But the importance of this operation pales compared to actually horrendous acts. Iran's suspicion to the US seems to go much farther back, though. It has to do more than just with the JCPOA, doesn't it?
This mistrust is high now, and people in both countries are able to reduce the level of mistrust to allow for normal transactions between the two countries. We hope that the US elite would step on this way. As long as they do not fully respect Iranian people and refuse to recognize Iran's independent role in regional and international affairs, this wall of mistrust will continue to exist.
To give a voice also to others, let's see what's being said on other media outlets. For that, I give you Shahrzad.
Hi, I'm Shahrzad Manucheri, and this is the news section of Iran Today. We'll be looking online for the latest update on Iran and the unreliability of the US, roots and causes. Tasnim news agency states that Iran has the right to distrust the US, says American analyst. A political expert based in the U.S. city of Atlanta defended the reasoning behind leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei's decision to reject the U.S.'s call for talks with Iran, saying the Islamic Republic has the right to distrust the Trump administration. Ayatollah Khamenei certainly has the right to not trust U.S. intentions based on the long history. Jim W. Dean, the managing editor of VeteransToday.com, told Tasneem in an interview, "One cannot even trust that Trump is sincere in wanting negotiations. He might be doing this just for show, so he can claim in his 2020 election campaign that he did all that he could do, but Iran refused to talk," he added. Foreign Affairs reports on how Iran sees its standoff with the United States. What will happen to the nuclear agreement? Ordinary Iranians are asking themselves every day. Why did the United States violate the deal, even though Iran remained faithful to it? Iran's economic situation has deteriorated since the U.S. administration of President Donald Trump reimposed sanctions after withdrawing from the deal. Iranians blame the United States for hardships in Iran. They do so because they are not convinced that the party did not keep its end of the nuclear bargain. Was the Trump administration, not the government of Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. The Washington Post claims former U.S. diplomats and European leaders call for easing of sanctions against Iran. 24 former diplomats and national security leaders from the United States and Europe called on the Trump administration to ease sanctions against Iran as part of the battle against the coronavirus pandemic. Even as the statement came out, an Iranian government spokesman said Iran would never ask the United States for help during the outbreak and demanded that sanctions be lifted instead. The reaction from Iran underscored the mutual distrust and heightened tension between the two nations. A part of the statement reads, "Just as the COVID-19 pandemic has upended every aspect of the global economy and of human lives and health, it has drastically changed the impact of a U.S. policy designed for a different purpose and conditions. Targeted sanctions relief would be both morally right and serve the health and security interests of the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world." That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
There are more recent examples of a lack of goodwill.
Iran
was seeking a way to end ongoing tensions with the US. When the US invaded Afghanistan and overthrew the Taliban regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran welcomed the removal of the Taliban regime. Iran was already fighting the Taliban for years. Exactly when Iran and the US were directly involved in Afghanistan's affairs, the US President George Bush bracketed Iran along with Iraq and North Korea in the axis of evil. It was not an appropriate answer to Iran's direct role in the overthrow of the Taliban regime. However, the Americans did so.
Later in 2018, America shirked its commitments to the Iran nuclear deal by unilaterally pulling out of the multilateral international deal known as the JCPOA, which was enacted by UN Resolution 2231. This was while Iran adhered to all its commitments, which were limiting its nuclear program in return for economic nuclear-related UN sanctions being lifted off this country. They were not lifted. They were reinforced as US sanctions, even with the corona pandemic.
We have seen 3 rounds of talks between President Donald Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. What was the result of those talks? That now Mr. Trump is insisting on talks with Iran. The US's issue with North Korea is only its nuclear program. But about Iran, there is a host of issues, and US officials are not determined to resolve their issues with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are rather seeking to impose their own will. That is why the mistrust continues.
The United States justified its actions by claiming Iran sought a nuclear weapon even with the JCPOA in the long term. This is while Iran's leader has issued a fatwa banning weapons of mass destruction, and Iran has been extremely transparent in its nuclear program. Interestingly, the United States is the only country that has used nuclear weapons against another country twice. Case in point, Japan's Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The leader's fatwa or decree dates back to the mid-1990s, though it was famously publicly announced in October 2003. Testament to Iran's sincerity is the fact that it never sought revenge for Ba'athist Iraq's chemical attacks, which killed 20,000 Iranians and severely injured 100,000 more.
After the US saw it was not possible to neutralize the Islamic Republic, its government instigated Saddam to attack Iran. During the first 5 to 6 years of the Iraqi-imposed war, the US did not enter a direct conflict with Iran. However, in 1986, we saw US warships supported the Iraqi regime in the Persian Gulf against Iran. The Americans were facilitating attacks on Iranian oil tankers. Iran's oil terminals were targeted. Several Iranian warships were targeted. These are examples of direct US intervention against Iran, as it did not want the Saddam regime to be overthrown.
Interestingly, while Iran is waging war single-handedly, more or less, on humanity's latest enemy, the coronavirus, the White House has privately urged military commanders to plan for an escalation of American combat with Iranians on Iraqi soil. Iran has been left to request for the first time since 1960 assistance from IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to combat the pandemic. Iran's requested emergency funding was for a sum of $5 billion. And that too the US has protested. If this is not a mixed or messed up message, what is? The United States is pursuing a policy of maximum pressure on Iranian lives, while at the same time talking about humanitarian offerings.
The US is facing medical shortages. New York needs 40,000 ventilators now. The US federal government did not supply this equipment, and New York had to purchase 30,000 ventilators directly from China. Therefore, the US could not meet its own domestic needs, not to mention help Iran. Iran has managed to meet its own basic needs. However, Iran's sanctions should be lifted so that the country would be able to import ventilators and pharmaceuticals because banks have to process transactions. Another aspect which sanctions are causing problem is about the transfer of money from Iranian benefactors living abroad to the Red Crescent Society. If the US really cares for humanitarian issues, it must take into consideration this aspect.
Iran's suspicions, which are now centered on the US, go back to incidents such as the Great Persian Famine of 1917 to 1919. That was a period of starvation and disease that killed 8 to 10 million Iranians under British occupation when Iran had declared neutrality in World War I. The British prevented imports of wheat and other food grains into Iran from Mesopotamia, Asia, and the USA. Also, ships loaded with wheat were not allowed to unload at Bushehr port in the Persian Gulf. The British blamed the famine only on hoarding by Iranian businessmen, however.
The West was looking down at East. It seems that the Western civilization, emboldened by inventions, is seeking more benefits. If we want to justify the West's attitude towards East, we should attribute it to the emergence of the Western civilization. It's been seen up until the 20th century in various forms like classic colonialism and then neo-colonialism. Is currently affecting the political, economic, military, security, and even cultural aspects.
Europe, including the UK, have today shown dignity in supporting Iran's fight against the coronavirus, as Iran has supported others. But while Europe has sold medicine to Tehran in its first bypass of US sanctions via Instex, Washington pressure groups and hardliners have vowed to crush that instrument in support of trade exchanges if it is used to help ease Iran's financial troubles.
The JCPOA period is a good test for Europe. The German Chancellor and the French President have acknowledged that the JCPOA is a good chance for them to see if they can adopt an independent policy in the world. They have admitted their failure in adopting an independent policy due to the European companies' dependence on the US.
The heir to European powers of the 20th century and frontrunner of democracy has a fine way of establishing talks with Iran, what it has said it wants. After a 40-year standoff it gave Iran for New Year its General Soleimani, assassinated on Iraqi soil, where he had landed as a guest of the Iraqi government.
They are opposed to the Islamic Republic of Iran's policies because they cannot tolerate an independent nation in the region. challenging the policies of the US's allies in the region.
From the once US Embassy in Tehran, the ambassador's room actually, which is now run by the Student Basij organization, it's bye from me and the whole team. Thanks for watching. Do tune in again at the same times next week and each week after, and don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.